life was pretty bad. I got into streaming and I turned my life around, and that was really cool. But I can't expect everybody to do what I did, right? Like everybody being able to join the NBA or to be like a streamer.
Well, of
or,
course, everybody
yeah,
has different qualities, sure.
Okay. So I used to be a lot more libertarian when I was 2021. And one of the things that dramatically changed kind of my view on government manipulation of things in the, I guess, in society came when it came time to deal with my son and the school that he went to. And one of the things that I noticed was when it came time to send my son to school, I could either do private education or I could do public. Personally, I did 12 years of Catholic private education. However, the public schools in Nebraska, depending on where you lived, were very, very, very good. And I opted for a certain district. I bought a house there. I moved there. And then my son was able to go to those schools. And he's been going through those schools. And the difference of availability of like technology, like these kids are taking home iPads in like first grade. They've got like huge computer labs and everything. Do you think that there is some type of, I don't want to say injustice or unfairness, because I'm not even looking at it that way, just pragmatically, that there might be children that are in certain schools that if they just had better funding or more access to technologies or things available to them, that those kids would become more productive members?
So the question, in my view, becomes what is the best school system? What produces the best results? So you have to ask yourself, what is going to produce superior results? Is it a government monopoly on education, a monolithic, centrally run system, or is it going to be competition between profit-seeking entities, between private schools? So if you had a free market in education, if you had schools that were competing for customers, then parents could choose which school to send their children to. It wouldn't be based on school districting or anything like that. It would be based on enrollment. Parents could choose which of the schools they wanted to send their kids to. And they would compete on a number of factors. They would compete on price, and they would compete on quality, as well as the philosophy of the principal or the school owner. So I think that given a fixed amount of funding, you're going to find that the free market system is a lot more efficient. Because there isn't really a strong incentive with the public sector system to save money or be efficient. So if you have a teacher who's not a very good teacher, they're not going to get fired so long as they're not doing anything scandalous, and the public school teachers union would go to bat for them. I mean, so long as they're showing up, they have a pulse. Even if they're not doing a very good job, they basically can't get fired. And there's no real incentive for anybody to try to get them fired. But the problem is they're not doing a good job. They're not supplying quality education to the children. So in a free market, there would be an incentive for the principal, for the owners of the school, whoever, to fire the worst teachers, to find better teachers to replace them, and to ensure that a higher quality of education was provided to children. There would also be a lot more incentive for innovation, and indeed just mechanisms for innovation, which simply wouldn't be, which aren't present in the centralized system of state-run education. So yes, I think definitely it can make a difference if you have better schools, but it's not simply a matter of throwing money at the problem. You need a better system in general.
That with like a little bit of a help, they could actually achieve more and do better for all of society.
So I think that on the list of priorities when it comes to education, the availability of technology is actually fairly low on the list of priorities.
Sure, the
Meaning
two
that
things I've heard are food availability and I think air conditioning, I think, are the two biggest ones that I hear, but sure.
Well, I mean, the biggest thing in terms of education itself, not just the physical facilities that we're talking about, would actually be two-parent family households.
Sure.
Communities that have fathers in them is actually the number one decisive, according to Roland Fryer and many studies done on this particular topic. And the idea that money alone, that investment of resources is the top priority in schooling is belied by the fact that LAUSD, which is where I went to school when I was younger, they pour an enormous amount of money into LAUSD. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars very often per student, and it does not result in better schooling outcomes. And so when you say, if we could give every kid an iPad, would you give every kid an iPad? The question is not, if I had a replicator machine from Star Trek, would I give everybody an enormous amount of stuff? Sure, I would. Every resource is finite. Every resource is limited, and you have to prioritize what are the outcomes that you seek in terms of the means with which you are seeking them. And so, again, I think that the question is I quibble with the premise of the question, which is that, again, the chief injustice when it comes to education on the list of injustices is lack of availability to technology, or that it's a funding problem. I just don't think that's the case.
Sure, and I can half agree with you there, but I don't think any amount of changes in the schools will create two-parent households, right? We can't bring it.
I totally agree with you.
So
that's why I think that the fundamental educational problem is not, in fact, a schooling problem. I think that it preexists that.
sure, but then I feel like I feel like this is kind of the conservative merry-go-round where it's like, what can we do to help with schools? So two of the things that I've seen, I think, that are usually brought up in research is one is air conditioning, that children in hotter environments just don't learn as well. And then the second one is access to food. So like kids that are given like a breakfast or a lunch that's provided at school, like increases educational outcomes. Now I agree that neither of these things might be determinative in like, well, 20% of kids were graduating and now 80% of kids are graduating, or these kids are all going, from with their GEDs into the workforce and now these kids are all suddenly becoming engineers. But in terms of where we can help, do you think there should be like...
There's a lot of possible areas for reform. Class sizes is definitely one that I think would make a huge difference, especially if you're going from like 30 to 10 or 30 to 5, some radical change like that. You could opt for more self-directed learning on the part of the student, more vocational training or co-op education at an earlier age, getting children into the workforce, a shift or two a week when they're 14, 15, networking with business owners and learning skills. A big thing I'd like to see is basically an end to subsidizing post-secondary education, because I don't think that most people need post-secondary education, but when the government's financing it so heavily, it works as a sorting mechanism by which employers can say, hey, well, this guy's got a college or university degree, so at least there's something there. When in reality, most college and university doesn't really prepare you very well for the jobs you're going to do after. So it's a huge expense to the taxpayer without much return. But going back to primary and secondary education, I think the important thing is that we need innovation. And that's one of the things that market in education would bring about naturally as schools have experimented with different styles. And some of them might be better, some of them might be worse. We could see that, we could evaluate that. Parents could evaluate that. It's also different children will have different educational needs, so they might respond better to a particular environment. Different policies with regards to violence. A lot of schools use a no tolerance policy, but what about defensive violence? Most importantly, I think that we need to recognize our own limitations. We don't have to plan the ideal school system. That's something that entrepreneurs often, who will be people, that have had a lifetime of experience in the field of education, can do much better than just a couple random schmucks sitting around, political ideologues that don't have training in this area. And I'm sure a lot of teachers have their own ideas on how things can be improved. So the bottom line is that when you have government public schools, when you have a government-run education system, it's going to be in a necessarily monolithic, centrally planned model. There's no room for innovation and change, no room for experimentation. You're going to have the same school system across the entire province, across the entire country. And what we really need is just a market in education where teachers, principals, entrepreneurs can apply different strategies and tactics, and parents can evaluate what works best for their child. and I think we'd see much, much more rapid improvement if we're to, in terms of educational results under such a system.
Threshold or minimum baseline of like at the very least every school should have a non-leaky gym, or every school should have if children can't afford lunch or breakfast, like some sort of food provided, or every school should have these like baseline things.
So again, I'm going to quibble with the premise of the question, because I think that when it comes to, for example, food insecurity, school food programs, again, you can always pour money into any program and at the margins create change. I mean, there's no doubt that pouring money onto anything will create change in a marginal way. The question is, how large is the margin and how big is the movement? Right. So the delta is what I'm looking at. And so I think that you're starting at a second order question, which is, what if we ignore what I would think are the big primary questions of education, namely family structure, value of education at home, how much you have parents who are capable or willing to help with homework, what are the incentive structures we can set up for a society that actually facilitate that, how local communities take ownership of their schools is a big one, right? All of these issues we're ignoring in favor of, say, air conditioning or lunch programs. And so in a vacuum, if you say air conditioning and lunch programs, sounds great in a vacuum. In terms of prioritization of values and cost structure, are those the things that I think are going to move the needle in a major way in terms of public policy? I do not. And in fact, I think that many of them end up being disproportionate wastes of money. I mean, I've talked before, pretty controversially, about the fact that an enormous amount of school lunch programs are thrown out. Like an enormous amount of that food ends up in the garbage can. Is there a better way to do that? If there is a better way to do it, then I'm perfectly willing to hear about that better way to do it. But it seems to me that one of the big flaws in the way that many people of the left approach government is, what if we hit every gnat with a hammer? And my question is, what if the gnat isn't even the problem? What if there is a much bigger substructure problem that needs to be solved in order to, if you're shifting deck chairs on the Titanic, sure, you can make the Titanic slightly more balanced because the deck chairs are slightly better oriented. But the real question is the water that's gaping into the Titanic, right?
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. But again, I feel like we're on the conservative merry-go-round then of never wanting to address
That's not a conservative merry-go-round. I can give you 10 ways.
Well, sure, but so like here would be the merry-go-round. I would say that like there's a minimum funding for schools that I think would help children. And then we go, well, the thing that would help them the most is two-parent households. And then I go, okay, well, two-parent households actually aren't the problem. The issue is access to things like birth control, so that people don't have children early on. And it's like, but the issue isn't actually birth control. The issue is actually you need a certain amount of money to move out early and to get married and then to have a two-parent household. So it's actually like economic opportunity.
No.
Well, it's not.
No, just two-parent households. That's
yeah,
it.
but like, what are the precursors?
Don't fuck people before you're married and have babies.
Sure.
Done.
That's great. We can say that and try to fight against, however many hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, but people will have sex and people will make babies.
And then they used to get married. The vast majority of people in this country with kids used to be married. The vast majority of people with kids in this country now are not married increasingly. That is obviously a societal change. Something changed. It wasn't human evolution.
But a lot of those things in terms of resting on whether or not people get married have to do with financial decisions. Do you have the money?
People are worse off now than they were 50, 60 years ago when the marriage rates were higher.
People are delaying the start of their careers because education is becoming increasingly important.
So in other words, people are richer now and they have more education now, and yet they're having more babies out of wedlock now because they're richer and have more education?
I'm saying that one of the biggest indicators for whether or not somebody's willing to get married is how much money both people are making if they can move out of their household. People don't tend to want to get married at 22 when they've just finished college, when they don't have the money to move out and they can't afford a house.
Because we have changed the moral status of marriage in the culture, meaning that everyone, poor, rich, and in between, used to get married. By the way, a huge percentage of marriages in the United States used to be what they would call shotgun marriages, meaning that somebody knocked somebody up, and because they did not want the baby to be born outside of a two-parent household, they would then get married.
Do we think that shotgun marriages, though, are a way to bring back equilibrium to education?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yes, 100%.
Do we
a
think
child
that,
deserves a mother and a father?
Sure.
Because that is the basis for all of this, including education.
Do we think that shotgun marriages are, well, let's say this. Do we think that that's a reasonable direction that society would ever take? Or is this like...
Yes, it was the reasonable direction for nearly all of modern history.
But history moves in one direction, right?
Why?
Because of time?
I mean, people don't think that this...
This is known as the Whig theory of history, that history is a steady progression onwards and upwards into the light. It's untrue. Yes, there is overall steady improvement, but it's more of a series of zigs and zags, things getting better and then things getting worse. I guess one obvious example would be prohibition, when alcohol was banned, and you had all these problems like the black market in alcohol and the gangs that surrounded liquor distribution. Another example is Nazism. Nazism was clearly much worse than Kaiser Wilhelmism or whatever preceded that disastrous ideology. Communism in Russia, and even in the 20th century in Canada and the US, the rise of the welfare state, the rise of big government, um, high taxes, or the rise of fiat money, worthless paper money, instead of having gold-backed money. Things absolutely can get worse.
In what way is that?
Is and I don't think we've ever regressed
yes,
social standards back to oh well, let's go 100 years back and do things that used to exist before.
That's weird. The entire left right now is arguing that we regress social standards by rejecting Roe versus Wade. So that's obviously not true.
The Roe versus Wade is not a social standard; it's a Supreme Court ruling. Number one. Number two, if you read the actual majority opinion on Roe v. Wade, we can see that socially we actually never made huge progress on how society viewed abortion. This has always been an incredibly divisive thing, right? Even that was, I think, part of Alito's writing on it was that things like gay marriage, for instance, we've kind of moved past, and it's not really as debated anymore. But abortion was never a settled topic, despite Roe v. Wade.
The notion that the arc of history constantly moves in one direction is belied by nearly all of the 20th century.
What do we mean by that?
I mean,
in
the
terms
first
of
half of
women's
the 20th
rights,
century
civil
is filled
rights,
with barbarism, communism, Nazism. All of that was a regression from what was happening at, for example, the beginning of the 19th century and the 20th century.
In what way?
Nazism and communism weren't a regression from what was going on in 1905.
These are in terms of communism being a regression. For instance, I'm not a communist, but the industrialization of the Soviet Union happened under a communist society.
The Swiss economist Jovan Pavlovsky calculated in 1969 that the real wages of Soviet industrial workers attained the level of 1913 only in 1963. That's 50 years of stagnation and decline. Ilya Zemstov, a former professor of sociology at the Lenin Institute of Baku, Azerbaijan, wrote in 1976 that 1 in 2 retired people in the Soviet Union live in poverty, and in the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan, 75% of the population lived below the poverty line. There were more homes without water, electricity, and toilets than in the whole of Western Europe. Other scholars calculated that about half of all housing in the Soviet Union was without running water or sewage. So the Soviet Union was a massive decline for the Russian people. Actually, Tsarist Russia, in the years before the October Revolution, was actually a fairly liberal nation. They had freedom of the press, even for the Bolshevik presses. During 18 of the last 24 years before the War of 1914, the World War, Tsarist Russia enjoyed the highest rate of industrial growth in the world, and by 1913 was overtaking France as the world's 4th industrialist power, obviously behind England and the United Kingdom and Germany. Tsarist Russia had a parliament, a Duma, trial by jury, independent courts, full freedom of foreign travel, independent trade unions. And they were also able to piggyback off Western technology, but their economic system was just horrendous. Did not do a good job of producing wealth.
The industrialization,
the murder of tens of millions of people.
Yeah, there's
I consider that a regression. A moral regression.
Not to mention the gulags, political repression, people being jailed for their political or religious beliefs. But even as an economic system, communism was an abject failure as well.
We're talking about now moral regression, and you're suggesting that moral regression, I wouldn't term a return to traditional values a moral regression. You would, but your suggestion is that history only moves in one direction, and I'm suggesting that history does not only move in one direction; it tends to move actually back and forth.
Sure. I don't think that all of history moves in one direction. There are going to be wars. There are going to be times of peace. I think in general we're more peaceful now than we have been in the past. But I think when we look at the way that people live their lives, I think that we tend to move in a certain direction socially. So when it comes to things like racism, or when it comes to things like slavery or women's rights, I think that there are two huge things that probably aren't changing in the U.S. And one is access to contraception, and one is women working jobs. I think that these two things are probably huge things that are moving us off of shotgun marriages or getting married very early on. And I don't see those. Do you think that those two things are going to change fundamentally?
First of all, what the data tend to show is that actually more highly educated people, as you were saying, tend to get married more. So if the idea is that women getting an education somehow throws them off marriage, it's the opposite. Usually
but those women
who are
aren't
not
getting,
educated.
But those women aren't getting shotgun marriages. Those women aren't having children.
Yeah,
when
but
they're
now
18,
you're
17.
shifting the topic. My topic was how to get more people married. And what I've been and then you suggested that higher levels of education are delaying marriage and making it less probable. And what I'm telling you, because this is what the data suggests, is that actually as you raise up the educational ladder, people tend to be married more than they are lower down on the educational ladder. If you're a high school graduate, you're less likely to be married than if you're a postdoc.
I agree with you, but that's because one of the biggest precursors to getting married is having like a level of economic stability. So as people get more educated, they obtain this economic stability, and then they're in a more comfortable position to explore more serious relationships.
There's another confound there. I mean, the confound is that people in stable marriages tend to be the children of stable marriages, and there's only one way to break that cycle, which is to create a stable marriage, and that is something that is in everyone's hands. Again, this notion that it is somehow an unbreakable, unshatterable barrier to get married and have kids, I don't understand where this is coming from. Why is that such a challenge?
I don't think it's unbreakable or unshatterable. The initial point was for school, if we can provide a minimum level of educational stuff for children, that'd probably be good. But when we retreat back to, well, it has to be the families that are fixed first, fixing families is a multivariate problem that has so many different...
I am fine. Within my local community, we all vote. Again, I've suggested that there's a difference between local community and federal. I'm fine with my local community voting for school lunches or air conditioning or whatever it is that we all agreed to do, because the more local you get, the more homogeneity you get in terms of interest, and the more interest you have in your neighbors. All of that's fine.
The other benefit of decentralization or having more control at the local level is that people can vote with their feet. They can find communities that have values that mesh with theirs, and they can leave communities where people have ideas or philosophies that are contra to how they want to live their life, or they want to see how their community is run.
Very solid community. In our community, we give to each other. We have minimum standards of helping one another. All of that's wonderful. When it comes to the actual problem of education, what I object to in the political sphere, and this happens all the time, is everybody is arguing on top of the iceberg about how we can move the needle 0.5 percentage points, as opposed to the entire iceberg melting beneath them. And we just ignore that, and we pretend that that's just, sort of the natural consequence of things. The arc of history suggests that people are never going to get married again. Well, I mean, actually what the arc of history suggests, realistically speaking, is that the people who are not getting married are not going to be having kids. And what it also suggests, the people who are married are going to be having kids. And so the demographic profile actually over time is rather going to shift toward people who are having lots and lots of kids. I'm married, I have 4 kids. Everyone in my community is married. It's like minimum buy-in in my community is 4 kids. Okay, and so what's happening actually in terms of demographics is that the people who are more religious and getting married are having more kids. And so if you're talking about the arc of history shifting toward marriage, I would suggest that actually demographically over time, long periods of time, not over one generation, over long periods of time, the only cure for low birth rate is going to be the people who get married and have lots of kids.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with any of that, but I'm just saying that, again, I know you're upset when I bring up the term merry-go-round. I think that there are good conversations to be had about people getting married because stable families produce stable children that are less likely to commit crime, that are more likely to go to school, that are more likely to be productive members of society, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to disagree with you on any of that. All of that is true. It's just frustrating that sometimes when you bring up any problem, all of it will circle back to other things that makes it seem like we can't make any progress in any area without like fixing something.
In what way? I mean, I literally just told you that on the local level, I'm fine for people voting for air conditioning.
Yeah, but so for instance, on the local level, so for school funding is done, I think, generally per district. So what do you do when you have poor districts that can't afford air conditioner for their schools?
I mean, the idea there would be that presumably if the society, meaning the state, and I generally don't mean the federal state, I mean like the state of California, for example, decides that everybody ought to have air conditioning, people will vote for air conditioning, and that's perfectly legal. And I don't think there's anything morally objectionable about that per se.
Cool.
I also don't think that that's going to heal anything remotely like the central problem.
Sure,
and I think that what tends to happen in terms of government is people love arguing about the problems that can be solved by opening a wallet, and nobody likes to solve a problem by, closing